2 patrol cars were already in my driveway when I opened the front door. Sunday morning, 8:47 a.m. My wife was in the front yard in jeans and a gardening shirt, trowel in her hand, looking at 2 uniformed officers the way she looked at everything she hadn't fully decided about yet still, and very quiet. Karen stood just behind them, clipboard under one arm, HOA lanyard around her neck, the smile of a woman who believed this was already over. "That woman doesn't belong here," Karen said, pointing directly at my wife. "I want her cited and removed from the premises immediately." On the ground, near my wife's knees, a crumpled orange HOA notice. Karen had taped it to our front door 3 days earlier. My wife had peeled it off the wood to keep it from damaging the finish. That was the crime. "This is HOA jurisdiction," Karen told the lead officer, her voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who has never once been told she was wrong. "I have full authority to request the removal and arrest of anyone interfering with lawful HOA enforcement on this property." She had just called 911 on the wrong woman. She didn't know that yet. I stepped onto the porch, still in my bathrobe. Neither officer had reached for anything. They were doing their jobs, professional and measured, responding to a dispatch call the way they'd been trained to. They didn't know yet either. Karen turned to me without slowing down. "Your household has been in non-compliance for 31 days. She glanced at her clipboard. "And this woman has now destroyed official HOA documentation posted to your property. This is a citation offense. I have already filed the paperwork," she said, posted, like it was a legal term. Like taping a notice to a private front door was the same thing as publishing a court order. My wife had peeled it off, carefully, to protect the wood. That was what Karen had told the 911 dispatcher was destruction of HOA property. The lead officer turned to my wife and asked her name. She gave her first name. Nothing else. He asked if she lived at this address. She said yes. He wrote something down and nodded. Karen shifted. She didn't like this pace. She was used to people folding faster. "I'd like this resolved now," she said, her voice climbing just slightly. She interfered with a lawful HOA process. That flower bed, a sharp gesture toward the low border of plants my wife had put in along our front walkway, is in direct violation of Section 4.2, subsection C of the HOA governing documents. This household has had 31 days to comply. They have chosen not to. That is why we are here. I watched the officer with the notebook. He didn't write that down. I remember standing very still on that porch. Not because I was afraid, because there's a specific kind of patience that comes from knowing exactly how a situation ends. It doesn't feel like calm. Exactly. It feels more like watching someone walk with total confidence toward a door you know is locked, and choosing not to mention it. Not yet. My wife hadn't moved, trowel still in her hand. She was looking at the officer nearest to her with the same expression she'd worn since I'd opened the door, steady, patient, a little tired. Not afraid. She was not afraid at all. And if Karen had been paying closer attention, that alone should have told her something. Karen kept talking. Something about escalation procedures, community standards. What happened to homeowners who decided the rules didn't apply to them? She had a practiced rhythm to it. I would later learn this was not the first driveway she had stood in with officers behind her. It was in fact the 11th time in 3 years that Karen had called law enforcement to back up an HOA enforcement action in our neighborhood. Of the 10 calls before this one, none of the responding officers had ever been introduced to the woman Karen was now trying to have removed from a yard she had tended for 14 months. One of them was about to be. "Officers," Karen said, drawing herself up, clipboard held out like it meant something, "I need you to formally document that this homeowner was presented with notice of violation, that the notice was deliberately destroyed, and that the resident is refusing to comply. That is all I am asking." The lead officer looked at my wife. My wife looked back at him with exactly the same expression she'd had since this started. He held her gaze for just a moment longer than the situation required. Then he looked down and wrote something in his notebook that I never got to see. I thought, "Karen, if you knew, if you had any idea who you were standing across from right now, you would not be here. You would not have made this call. You would not have smiled when those cars pulled in." She had no idea she'd just called 911 on the one woman whose signature authorizes every patrol officer's badge in this county. I let her keep talking. I let her stand there in my driveway with her clipboard and her lanyard and her absolute certainty. I let the moment breathe. Because what was coming would need exactly this, every word she'd said this morning, On record, on camera, permanent. The crumpled orange notice lay in the grass near the flower bed. Small, irrelevant looking. The way the first domino always looks before the others fall. I was going to frame that piece of paper. I just didn't know it yet. What Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, standing in my driveway that Sunday morning, was that the woman she'd just called the police on was the police. We moved into the neighborhood 14 months before that Sunday morning. My wife had picked the house. She liked the yard big enough for a real garden, she said, and the light in the late afternoon came through the back windows in a way she'd been chasing since we left our last place. We signed the papers in October. By November, we had boxes unpacked, a second-hand couch we liked too much to replace, and a sense that this was the kind of street where people waved when they pulled out of driveways. We were right about the waving. We were wrong about why. The first warning came 6 days after we moved in. Not from Karen. From an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who had lived at number 14 for 11 years, and who knocked on our door on a Tuesday evening carrying a small plate of almond cookies like she was paying a social call. She was not paying a social call. She sat in our kitchen for exactly 12 minutes. She didn't complain about anything. She didn't warn us about anything directly. She looked at my wife and then at me and said very quietly, "You both seem like nice people. Just do what she says. It's easier." Then she stood up, thanked us for the tea, and left. I asked my wife what she thought that meant. My wife said, "It means there's something on this street we don't know about yet." She was right. There usually is. Her name was Linda Carver, 61 years old, HOA president for 6 consecutive years, which is the kind of tenure that doesn't happen by accident. 2 people had tried to run against her in that time. The first, a retired contractor named Malone, had 3 citations in his mailbox within a week of announcing his candidacy. Overgrown grass, a fence post that allegedly measured 2 inches higher than the permitted maximum, a garbage bin visible from the street on a non-collection day. He withdrew before the ballot was printed. The second challenger lasted 4 days. She moved out the following spring. After that, nobody ran. The board had 3 seats. All 3 were filled by Karen's allies. The meeting minutes I later obtained showed no dissent on record for 4 consecutive years. Not one disagreement. Not one abstaining vote. 3 seats, 3 people. Every motion carried 3-0 like a metronome. If you didn't know what you were looking at, it might have seemed like a very harmonious neighborhood. It was not a harmonious neighborhood. It was a quiet one. There's a difference. Karen had called law enforcement to support an HOA enforcement action 11 times in 3 years. I want you to understand what that number represents. Not noise complaints, not actual crimes. 11 calls, across a development of 96 homes, for things like unauthorized vehicle parking, unapproved landscaping, a basketball hoop someone's kid had left in a driveway, and a dispute over whether a screen door was the correct shade of beige. 11 times, Karen had decided that the weight of the law needed to be brought to bear on a homeowner's flower pot or fence stain. 11 times, officers had come. 11 times, the homeowner had backed down. Because what else do you do when there are police at your door and a woman with a clipboard telling you that you're in violation of community standards? You pay, you comply, you get quieter. The man who taught me the most about this was my neighbor, 2 doors down, a retired high school history teacher named James Okafor, who had lived in his house for 9 years, and who, by the time I met him, had the particular stillness of someone who had learned that making noise cost money. His story was simple and monstrous. 14 months before we arrived, Karen had cited him for his mailbox post. Not the mailbox itself, the post. Specifically, the color of the post, a shade of black that Karen determined, did not match the approved HOA palette. The approved color, according to the document Karen distributed, was called Midnight Standard. Okafor's post, she claimed, was closer to charcoal matte. They looked identical to me. They looked identical to everyone except Karen. The initial fine was $150. When he disputed it, a second fine was added for non-compliance. Then a third for failure to attend a mandatory compliance meeting he had not been notified of in time. By the time 8 months had passed, the fines, fees, and what Karen called administrative processing costs had totaled $3,400. He came within 2 payments of missing his mortgage. He paid all of it. Because the alternative, fighting it through a lawyer, would have cost more than the fines themselves. He kept the paperwork in a drawer in his kitchen. I know because he showed me. This is what Karen had built over 6 years. Not a neighborhood, but a system, a closed loop of fear and compliance in which the rules meant whatever Karen said they meant. The fines were whatever Karen said they were, and the only way out was to leave. 83% of the people on our street, when I eventually walked it door by door, told me some version of the same thing Mrs. Chen had said on that first Tuesday evening. Just do what she says. It's easier. My wife heard all of this and didn't say much. She rarely did when she was thinking. She worked long days county administration, is what we told people, which was true in the most literal sense of the phrase, and she was careful, always, about the line between her job and her private life. She valued that separation. She protected it. Nobody on the street knew what she actually did. Nobody knew yet. What she did know, after listening to James Okafor describe $3,400 in fines for a mailbox post, was the same thing I knew, that this had been going on long enough, that someone needed to look at Karen's paperwork very carefully, and that the first step was not a confrontation. The first step was a folder. I went home and opened my laptop. It was a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after we moved in, when Karen came to the door. I heard the gate latch first. That precise little click of someone who knew exactly where it was and had used it before. I looked through the front window and saw her coming up the path in that particular walk clipboard at her side, measuring tape looped around her neck like a lanyard, the HOA badge sitting just below her collar. She wasn't rushing. She never rushed. Rushing would imply she wasn't certain of the outcome. I opened the door before she knocked. She looked at me the way people look at furniture they're about to rearrange. No greeting, no introduction. She had been president of this HOA for 6 years. She didn't need to introduce herself anymore. She simply held out a folded document and waited for me to take it. I took it. Unapproved landscaping modification, she said, while I was still opening it. The flower beds along your front walkway were installed without prior written HOA approval as required by the governing documents. The fine is $500. You have 30 days to remove the modification and restore the original ground cover. The notice was printed on HOA letterhead. It had a case number. It had Karen's signature at the bottom in blue ink, the kind of signature that had been applied to enough documents that it had become efficient, almost mechanical. I read the whole thing before I looked up. Which section of the bylaws prohibits this? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Section 4.2, subsection C. She said it the way you say something you've said enough times that it has become its own kind of truth. No pause, no reference to the clipboard. Just the citation, delivered clean and flat, like a door closing. I'll review that, I said. Something shifted in her expression. Just slightly. I would learn, over the following months, that Karen was accustomed to one of two reactions at this point in the conversation. Immediate compliance, or immediate argument. Compliance she preferred. Argument she was better at. What she was not prepared for, what apparently nobody on this street had ever given her, was the calm, flat, information-gathering response of someone who had decided nothing yet. She decided, I needed to understand the stakes more clearly. Non-compliance triggers a daily fine of $75 beginning this Monday, she said. After 30 days of continued non-compliance, I will file a lien against this property. After the lien, the HOA has the right to initiate foreclosure proceedings. I want to make sure you understand what that means. She paused there. For effect, I think. To let the word foreclosure sit in the air of my own doorway. I understood what it meant. I understood it the way James Okafor had understood it, and Mrs. Chen, and every other person on this street who had stood where I was standing and done the math and found that the cost of fighting was higher than the cost of paying. Karen had built her entire system on that math, on the reliable human instinct to calculate the path of least resistance and walk down it quickly, before anyone had time to ask whether there was another path at all. I said, I appreciate the clarification. She looked at me for a moment. Then my wife appeared at my shoulder. Karen glanced at her one brief, flat look, the way you register a detail that isn't relevant to your current task, and then turned back to me. Only to me. For the rest of the conversation, she spoke as if my wife had not arrived, as if she were a piece of furniture that had entered the room. I suggest you get your wife to undo what she's done before this gets expensive, Karen said. The flower beds were her project, I assume. It would be straightforward enough to restore the original ground cover. The fine can be waived if compliance is achieved within 10 days. I have done this for other homeowners. It's not personal. She said it's not personal the way people say it when they very much intend for it to be. Then she turned and went back down the path, through the gate, with the same efficient walk she'd arrived with. At the end of the front path, one hand on the gate latch, she turned back. "I've had lawyers on this street," she said. "Doctors, even a judge, 2 years ago, in the house on the corner. They all paid up." A brief pause. "You're no different." The gate clicked shut. I stood in the doorway for another moment, watching her cross back toward her car. Then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The HOA's registered governing documents were filed with the county recorder's office. This is public information, anyone can request them. I had the full document in a browser tab inside 4 minutes. I read section 4.2 carefully, then subsection C. Section 4.2 governed modifications to common area structures. Subsection C addressed commercial use installations on properties with mixed zoning classifications. It said nothing about residential landscaping, nothing about flower beds, nothing about front walkways. The provision Karen had cited, with the calm authority of someone who had been citing it for years, did not say what Karen said it said. I read it a second time to be certain. Then I opened a new folder on my desktop. I typed the label slowly, like I was naming something that mattered. HOA. I saved the fine notice. I saved the screenshot of the actual section 4.2 text. I started a running document with today's date, Karen's name, and her exact words, section 4.2, subsection C written out verbatim, with the time of the visit noted underneath. My wife came in from the hallway, saw the screen, and stood behind me for a moment reading. "Do it the right way," she said quietly. "Get everything in writing." She had no idea yet what I was going to find. Or maybe she did, and she was just waiting for me to find it myself. I kept reading. I spent the following week walking the street, not to organize anything, not to recruit. I just knocked on doors in the early evening, introduced myself properly for the first time to people I'd only waved at from driveways, and asked a simple question. Had they ever had a problem with the HOA? The first 3 doors, people smiled politely and said everything was fine. The 4th door, a man named Gerald opened it, looked past me to check whether anyone was watching from the street, and then said, "How long do you have?" 14 homeowners talked to me in some detail over those 7 days. Most of them were careful voices kept low, eyes that moved to windows and front paths while they talked. They had all paid fines at some point. Some of them were still paying, on quiet installment plans they'd negotiated with Karen to avoid the threat of liens. They had all reached the same conclusion independently, arrived at it alone. It was easier to comply. 6 of them agreed to do more than talk. 6 people, out of 96 homes, were willing to put their documented incidents in writing and contribute them to a shared file. That might sound like a small number. Sitting across from Gerald, Mrs. Chen, and James Okafor, understanding what they'd risked just by opening their door to me, it felt like more than enough. Mrs. Chen answered her door in the late afternoon light, looked at me for a moment, and stood back to let me in without me having to ask. She made tea, set it in front of me, and went to the back of the house. She came back carrying a manila folder held together with a rubber band that had been on it long enough to leave a groove in the cardboard. She set it on the table between us. Inside, 23 HOA violation notices spanning 4 years. Not 23 incidents, 23 formal notices, each with a case number and Karen's blue ink signature. Notices for a wind chime, for a doormat that extended 2 inches past the threshold, for a planter box the wrong shade of terracotta, for her car parked 1 foot over an invisible HOA boundary line in her own driveway on a Sunday. She had paid every fine, not because she believed she was wrong, because she couldn't afford to find out what happened if she said so. "I kept them," she said quietly, looking at the stack. "In case it ever mattered." It was going to matter. James Okafor didn't make tea. He slid a document across his kitchen table without preamble, the way people hand over things they've been carrying too long. The lien was still active. 9 months after he'd paid the last fine, the lien against his property title had never been released. A lien tells every bank and buyer that there's an outstanding debt attached to the home. It doesn't disappear when you pay someone has to file a release. Karen hadn't. For 9 months, it had quietly blocked Okafor from refinancing his mortgage at a better rate. He'd spoken to 2 attorneys. Both said the same thing. It would cost more to fight the release than the interest savings were worth. He was a retired history teacher. He had lived in this house for 9 years and done nothing except paint a mailbox post the wrong shade of black. I photographed both documents before I left. Then I went home and opened the folder again. The county recorder's office keeps the official filed version of every HOA's governing documents, the legal version, not whatever a president chooses to distribute to residents. I'd requested it the day after Karen's visit. Now, I had both versions open side by side on my screen. They were not the same. Karen's distributed copy contained a bylaw amendment dated February 2022. That amendment introduced the landscaping provision she'd been citing against me, and I now realized, against others. The county-filed version had no such amendment. It had never been submitted. Under state law, an amendment that isn't properly adopted and filed simply isn't enforceable. It doesn't matter how many times you cite it. Karen had been fining people for 3 years under a rule that didn't legally exist. I sat with that for a while. Then I picked up the phone and called the attorney I'd been referred to. We talked for 40 minutes. He asked me to send everything. I did that night, from the kitchen table, while my wife read in the next room. She came through once, paused behind me, and looked at the 2 documents highlighted side by side on my screen. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and walked back down the hallway. A short call, 3 minutes, maybe 4. When she came back, she looked at me and said, "Keep going. Document everything." I asked who she'd called. "Someone who should know," she said. I didn't push. I turned back to the screen and kept building the file. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was alone in the kitchen. My wife had left for work before 7, the way she usually did. I poured a second cup of coffee, picked up the envelope from the counter where I'd left it after signing for it at the door, and sat down at the kitchen table. I recognized the HOA letterhead before I finished opening it. Karen, acting in her capacity as HOA president, had filed a formal lien against our property. The total amount, $4,200 in accumulated fines and administrative fees. She had attached a breakdown. I read it slowly, the way you read something you want to be absolutely certain you understand before you react to it. $500 original fine. 45 days at $75 per day. $3,375. A legal processing fee of $325. I added those numbers on the back of the envelope. They came to $4,200, exactly. But they also came to $4,200, exactly no matter how I arranged them. Which meant Karen had backed into the round number and built the breakdown to fit it. The processing fee wasn't itemized. There was no invoice attached. There was no rate schedule for what legal processing cost or how it was calculated. She had charged us for something she hadn't defined, because she'd done this enough times to know that nobody checked. I sat there for a moment looking at the document. A lien against a property title is not a fine. It's a legal claim attached to the home itself. It follows the deed, not the owner. It tells every bank, every title company, every prospective buyer that there is an outstanding debt on this property that must be resolved before anything else can happen. You can't refinance. In most HOA-governed states, if the lien goes unanswered long enough, the HOA can use it as the foundation for foreclosure proceedings. This was no longer Karen sending notices with her blue ink signature. This was a document filed with the county recorder. Our home's title now had Karen's name on it. I called my attorney. He'd reviewed the files I sent him after our door-to-door week. He was not surprised by the lien. He told me it was a predictable next step given Karen's pattern. His assessment was measured and not entirely encouraging. The underlying fine was legally questionable, he said. Given the bylaw defects we'd identified, the lien was challengeable, but challenging it through standard legal channels would take 6 to 8 months and would cost more in attorney fees than the lien amount itself. The HOA's legal structure was designed to make that math work in Karen's favor. Always. He paused. Then he said, "If you have any other leverage available to you, anything at all, now would be the time to think about using it." I said I'd think about it. What I thought was, not yet. I wanted Karen fully committed. I wanted every action documented on county record, in writing, with her name on it. I wanted her so certain of her own authority that she wouldn't think to look at who she was up against until the moment it was too late to look away. The lien was filed. It was permanent. It was on record. And every action Karen took from here forward would be on record alongside it. Not yet. That same afternoon, Karen sent a mass email to all 96 homeowners in the development. The subject line read, HOA enforcement policy and non-compliant homeowners. She didn't name us. She didn't need to. The email described the situation with enough specificity that anyone who'd heard about the Sunday morning patrol cars, and everyone had heard by then, knew exactly which household she was referring to. She outlined the fine history, the lien filing, and the next steps available to the HOA under its governing documents. She closed with a single sentence that I read 3 times before I moved on. Continued non-compliance will result in escalation to foreclosure proceedings per HOA governing documents. She had never put that in writing before. Not in an email to 96 households. Not with that finality. My phone lit up within 20 minutes of the email landing. 3 separate neighbors texting within the same window. Gerald said nothing, just forwarded it with a single question mark. Mrs. Chen wrote, "I got the email. Are you okay?" And a man 2 streets over someone I'd never met sent 4 words. "She's never done this before." He meant the foreclosure threat. In writing. Distributed to the entire community. I forwarded the email to my attorney. I added it to the folder. Then I forwarded it to 1 other person. I didn't write an explanation. I didn't need to. I just attached the email and sent it, and I put my phone face down on the table. I did not call Karen. I did not respond to her email. I did not send a letter, make a complaint, or post anything in the neighborhood group chat where several people were now responding to Karen's message with the careful, non-committal language of people who had learned not to leave fingerprints. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the lien document for a long time. Then I put it in the folder, closed my laptop, and went to make dinner. Karen had just filed a lien on our home. She had threatened foreclosure in writing, distributed to every household on our street, on permanent digital record. But she'd also just made the second biggest mistake of her life. The first was calling the cops on my wife. The notice went out to all 96 homeowners on a Wednesday. Special enforcement meeting, that was the official title on the agenda. Thursday evening, 7 o'clock, community room at the end of Birchwood Court. Attendance strongly encouraged. The agenda item was listed as non-compliant homeowner escalation review and board vote. Karen had called these meetings before. Usually, 8 or 10 people showed up, mostly Karen's allies. The vote would happen, the motion would carry, and the non-compliant homeowner would receive a formal notice the following morning that made their options very clear. This time, 67 people came. The community room held 40. By 7 o'clock, there were people standing in the hallway, people leaning against the back wall, people pressed into the doorframe with their arms folded. Gerald was there. Mrs. Chen had taken a seat near the middle. James Okafor stood against the left wall with his hands in his pockets and his face completely still. Karen stood at the front of the room and looked out at the crowd and smiled. She thought they had come to watch her win. That was her first mistake of the evening. I arrived with my attorney, a quiet man named Pearson who carried a single leather briefcase and had the unhurried manner of someone who had sat in a great many rooms like this one and found none of them particularly intimidating. I had my manila folder. We took seats near the center of the room. My wife came in 3 minutes after we sat down. She was in street clothes, dark jeans, a plain navy jacket, hair pulled back. She scanned the room once, the same way she always scanned a room, quickly and completely. The way people do when reading a space is a professional habit, and then she took a seat in the front row, 1 chair from the end, and sat with her hands folded in her lap. No one in that room, except me, knew who she was. Karen hadn't looked up when my wife came in. She was arranging documents at the board table, speaking in low tones to her 2 allies, a man named Holt, who sold insurance and had served on the board for 4 years, and a woman named Patrice, who had seconded every motion Karen had ever made. Karen's collection attorney sat at the far end of the table with his briefcase open and his hands folded on top of it. At 7:03, Karen called the meeting to order. She was good at this. I'll give her that. She had the practiced confidence of someone who had run these meetings so many times they had become almost ceremonial, a formality before the outcome she had already determined. She presented the case against us in full, the flower beds, the violation notice, the fine history, the daily accumulation, the lien filing. She read the numbers cleanly. She cited section 4.2, subsection C, without hesitation. She showed a printed timeline on a single page and passed it to Holt and Patrice for the record. Then she paused, looked up at the room, and said, the household in question had 31 days to comply. They chose not to. They have had multiple opportunities to resolve this matter quietly. They have declined each one. What you're seeing tonight is the HOA doing exactly what it exists to do, protecting community standards on behalf of all 96 homeowners. She gestured at the crowd as she said it, including them, making them part of it. A few people shifted in their seats. Nobody spoke. Then Karen said, During the incident that precipitated the lien filing, the homeowner's wife was present in the yard and was uncooperative when officers arrived to document the violation. Her behavior was part of a pattern of deliberate non-compliance by this household. She still didn't know who she was describing. She said it the way she'd said everything else, cleanly, with authority, as a matter of record. From the front row, my wife said nothing. She sat with her hands folded and her face calm and watched Karen talk about her. Karen called for the vote. I move that the board authorize the HOA's collection attorney to initiate foreclosure proceedings against the non-compliant property at 44 Birchwood Court, pursuant to the lien filed on record with the county recorder. Holt seconded it. Patrice raised her hand. Karen raised hers. 3-0. She looked directly at me when she announced the result. Her expression was not triumphant exactly. It was something more settled than that. The look of someone confirming what they already knew. This, she said, is what happens when you ignore the HOA. Pearson stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He simply stood and said, in a tone that was perfectly even, I'd like to address some threshold legal questions before this matter proceeds to external action. The board should hear this before authorizing the collection attorney. Karen's jaw tightened. This is a board meeting, not a public forum. From somewhere in the back third of the room, I didn't see who spoke first. A voice said, let him talk. Then two more. Then several at once. Not shouting. Just people who had been quiet for 6 years, deciding, in that specific moment, to stop. Karen's hand moved toward her gavel. She looked at the crowd. She put her hand back down. Pearson waited until the room settled, then said, before this matter proceeds, the board must address a question about the validity of the fines underlying this lien. We have reason to believe the bylaw provision cited Section 4.2, subsection C does not exist in the registered governing documents filed with the county recorder. The room went very still. Karen's voice came back flat and hard. This isn't a courtroom. Pearson looked at her for a moment. No, he said, but it will be. No one spoke for 3 seconds. I counted. Holt turned his head slightly toward the door. Karen's collection attorney, at the far end of the table, had stopped writing. Then the door at the back of the room opened. 2 uniformed deputies came in. Karen saw them immediately. She'd called the county non-emergency line that afternoon to request a security presence for the meeting. A crowd this size, she'd said, warranted it. She'd gotten confirmation. She'd noted it in her meeting log. She gave them a brief, satisfied nod from the front of the room. One of the deputies nodded back. The other took a position along the wall and looked straight ahead. He did not look at Karen. He had not looked at Karen since he came through the door. He was looking at the front row. My wife sat in the front row. She hadn't worn her uniform, but she had brought her ID. Pearson started where he'd left off. The room was still arranged the same way it had been when Karen called the vote. Karen and her board at the front table. Holt and Patrice on either side of her. The collection attorney at the far end. 67 people in a room built for 40. The 2 deputies along the back wall. My wife in the front row. Pearson stood and addressed the board the way he addressed every board, calmly, without theater, as though what he was about to say was simply information that needed to be in the room. He told them he had obtained the official HOA governing documents from the county recorder's office. He told them he had compared those documents with the version Karen had been distributing to residents. He told them that the bylaw provision, cited as the basis for every fine this household had received, Section 4.2, subsection C, as described by the HOA president, did not appear in the filed legal version of the governing documents. Karen interrupted before he finished the sentence. The governing documents are the documents I distribute, she said. I am the president of this HOA. I maintain the records. Pearson waited until she finished. The governing documents, he said, are the ones filed with the county recorder. Would you like to see them? She interrupted again, something about procedural order, about the vote having already been taken, about this being an enforcement meeting and not an appeal. She was still controlled, still authoritative, but there was something different in the rhythm of it now. She was talking faster than she needed to. Holt, to her left, had pushed his chair back approximately 3 inches from the table. I noticed it the way you notice small things when you've been watching someone carefully for a long time. He hadn't stood up. He hadn't said anything. He had just moved 3 inches toward the door and hoped nobody saw. I saw. From the front row, my wife stood up. She did it without announcement, just unfolded from the chair the way she did everything, with an economy of motion that didn't ask permission. She said, in a normal voice, I'd like to address the board. Karen's head turned. Her expression was the one she'd worn every time she'd dismissed a homeowner who hadn't understood how these meetings worked. We're not in an open comment period, Karen said. The deputy along the left wall, the one who had not looked at Karen since he came through the door, said one word. Mom. He said it quietly. He said it to Karen. He was not looking at Karen. The room felt it before it understood it. That particular quality of silence that comes when 67 people simultaneously sense that something has changed but can't yet name what. I watched a woman in the third row turn to the man beside her and then turn back without saying anything. I watched Patrice's hands go still on the table. Karen turned toward the deputy. Started to say something. He said it again. Ma'am. Same tone. Same direction. My wife walked to the table. She reached into the inside pocket of her navy jacket. She removed her wallet. She opened it, and she placed her county sheriff's badge and her official identification on the HOA meeting table, directly in front of Karen Carver. She didn't slam it. She placed it. Flat and clean and permanent, the way you set down something that has always been exactly what it is. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Karen looked at the badge. She looked at my wife. She looked at the two deputies along the wall. The deputies were looking at their boss. Not at Karen. Not at the board. Not at the crowd of 67 people who had filled a room built for 40. They were looking at the woman who had just set her credentials on the table, and their expressions were the careful, professional expressions of two officers who understood exactly what had just happened and were waiting to follow her lead. Karen's mouth opened slightly. She closed it. My wife spoke at normal volume, her hands clasped in front of her, her tone the same tone she'd used to say good morning to me for 14 months. My name is Sarah Mercer. I am the elected county sheriff of this county. The two officers standing along that wall are deputies under my command. She didn't gesture toward them. She didn't need to. On the Sunday morning 11 days ago, you placed a 911 call from this neighborhood that resulted in 2 patrol units being dispatched to my private residence. Those officers were directed, by you, to document a violation, remove me from my own yard, and place me under citation. She opened a second folder she'd been holding at her side. She didn't rush it. The body camera footage from that dispatch is now in the possession of the county attorney's office. She placed a single document on the table beside the badge. On that footage, you stated that you had, and I'm using your exact words, full authority to request the removal and arrest of anyone interfering with lawful HOA enforcement on this property. You described this as HOA jurisdiction. The county attorney is reviewing whether that 911 call constitutes misuse of emergency services under state statute. She set the document down and looked at Karen. Karen said nothing. At the far end of the table, the collection attorney very slowly closed the lid of his briefcase. Patrice, Karen's second board ally, the woman who had seconded every motion Karen had made in 4 years, stood up. She didn't say anything. She picked up her bag from the back of her chair. She walked to the door at the side of the room and went through it. The door swung shut behind her. The sound of it was very loud in the silence. 67 people watched her go. Pearson stepped forward. He set the county-filed HOA governing documents on the table, open to section 4.2. Then, beside it, he set Karen's distributed version, open to the same section. He set them side by side without speaking and let the room look. He waited 10 seconds. Then he placed a third document on the table. This is the bylaw amendment dated February 2022, he said. This is the amendment that introduced the landscaping provision cited against my client's household. This is the amendment that has been cited in fine notices distributed to residents of this development for 3 years. He placed one more sheet beside it, a printout from the county recorder's public filing system. This is the county recorder's filing record for this HOA's governing documents. The 2022 amendment does not appear. It was never submitted. Under state law, an unadopted, unfiled amendment is not enforceable. He stepped back. I looked at Karen. Her clipboard was still on the table in front of her. Her measuring tape was still around her neck. She was looking at the documents Pearson had laid out, and she had the expression of someone watching a structure they believed to be permanent demonstrate that it was not. I stood up. The lien filed against our property is derived entirely from fines based on a bylaw provision that does not exist in any legally filed HOA document, I said. We are requesting that the lien be formally vacated tonight, and we are requesting that the board review every fine issued under this amendment over the past 3 years. I sat back down. The room was quiet for a long time. In the third row, Mrs. Chen made a small sound, not a word, just a breath released after being held for too long. James Okafor, standing against the left wall with his hands in his pockets, straightened up slowly and stood at his full height for the first time since I'd known him. He didn't speak, he just stood. Gerald, somewhere near the back, said, "How many fines?" Nobody answered. Nobody needed to yet. At the board table, HOAHAKAREN's first ally, the one who'd moved 3 inches toward the door, looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at the table. Then he said, to no one in particular, "I need to recuse myself from any further votes tonight." He said it to the surface of the table. Karen didn't look at him. She was still looking at the badge. It sat on the HOA meeting table, directly in front of her, beside her clipboard, beside her printed violation timeline, beside the measuring tape she'd worn to 100 of these meetings across 6 years of running this neighborhood like it was something she owned. County Sheriff's badge. Plain as anything. Right there on the table. She had called the police on the county sheriff. She had filed a lien on the county sheriff's home. She had stood in the county sheriff's driveway on a Sunday morning and told 2 of the county sheriff's own deputies to remove the county sheriff from the county sheriff's yard for peeling an HOA notice off her own front door. She had done all of this because she had looked at my wife in a gardening shirt with a trowel in her hand and decided she was nobody. I watched Karen sit there with that knowledge settling over her, and I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The county attorney's office opened a formal inquiry into the HOA's pattern of emergency services deployment 8 days after the meeting. 11 calls in 3 years, each one logged, each one now being reviewed against a single question. Were any of them misuse of the 911 system for the purpose of civil enforcement? I didn't file a complaint to start that inquiry. I didn't need to. The body cam footage from the Sunday morning dispatch had already been reviewed by people whose job it was to notice exactly that kind of thing. Karen received a formal billing notice from the county 14 days after the meeting. The cost of the Sunday morning patrol response, 2 units, 2 deputies, 47 minutes billed directly to her under the county's misuse of emergency services statute. It was not a large number. It was a specific one, and it had her name on it, filed on county record alongside the body cam transcript and her own words. I think about that sometimes. The specificity of accountability. How it doesn't need to be enormous to be exact. Our fines were vacated within 10 days of the meeting. All of them, the original 500, the daily accumulations, the unitemized processing fee Karen had built into the lien total. The lien itself was removed from our property title on a Thursday afternoon. I know it was a Thursday because I was sitting at the kitchen table when my attorney called to confirm it, and I remember looking at the window and thinking that the light in the late afternoon came through exactly the way my wife had said it would when we first looked at this house. The HOA was required to cover our attorney fees, $3,200, paid within 30 days of a formal demand letter. The 2022 bylaw amendment, Karen's amendment, the one she had distributed as law for 3 years without ever filing it with the county, was declared invalid by the county court 4 weeks later, retroactively. Every fine issued under that amendment, to every homeowner in this development, was subject to review for potential refund. That was the sentence that got very quiet in a room of people who had been paying Karen's invented rules for 3 years. James Okafor came over on a Saturday morning. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had opened Karen's certified letter 6 weeks earlier, and I watched him read the formal notice confirming that his lien had been vacated and that the interim HOA board had initiated a refund review for prior fines. He read it twice. Then he opened the kitchen drawer he'd brought with him, and he took out the original lien document, the one he'd kept for 9 months, the one he'd shown me the first week. I knocked on his door, and he fed it into my paper shredder 1 page at a time. He didn't say anything while he did it. Neither did I. Some moments don't need narration. The interim board had been formed within a week of the meeting. Karen did not file to run in the emergency election. Holt resigned before the ballot was printed. Patrice had not returned to the neighborhood since the night she walked out of the community room. 3 new board members were elected: James Okafor, Gerald from 4 doors down, and Mrs. Chen, who had kept 23 violation notices in a rubber-banded folder for 4 years, just in case it ever mattered. It mattered. I heard afterward that Mrs. Chen's first board meeting ran 40 minutes. The entire agenda was a review of fines issued under the invalidated 2022 amendment and a framework for processing refund requests. She called the meeting to order herself, sitting in the chair at the head of the table where Karen had sat for 6 years, and the first thing she did was ask for a motion to set the agenda. Someone seconded it. The vote was unanimous. 3-0. The right kind. I think about my wife through all of it. I think about how she handled every part of what happened from the Sunday morning in the yard with the trowel in her hand, to the front row of that meeting, to the moment she set her badge on the table and said her name in the same voice she used to say good morning to me. She never raised it. Not once. She never made it personal, never made it theatrical, never used her position as anything other than exactly what it was information Karen needed to have, delivered at the moment it would do the most good for the most people. I thought of something Karen had said at our front door in those early weeks. Standing at the gate on her way out, one hand on the latch. I've had lawyers on this street. Doctors. Even a judge, 2 years ago, in the house on the corner. They all paid up. I let that sit where it was. It didn't need anything added to it. The following Saturday was clear and cool. My wife was in the front yard in jeans and a gardening shirt, the same one she'd been wearing the morning the patrol cars came. I handed her the trowel. She was putting in a second row of plants along the border of the walkway, extending the flower bed that had started all of this, adding to it, making it larger. No patrol cars in the driveway, no clipboard at the gate, no orange notice taped to the front door. A kid from the end of the street rode past on a bicycle and waved at us, and kept going, and the street was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years. Not the quiet of 67 people staying careful, just quiet. I stood there in my own yard on my own property and felt the specific, ordinary satisfaction of a Saturday morning that belongs entirely to you. Inside, on the wall of my home office, there is a small frame. Dollar store, nothing special. Inside it, a crumpled orange HOA violation notice, the one Karen had taped to our front door 3 days before the Sunday she called the police. The one my wife had peeled off carefully to protect the wood. The one that was lying in the grass near the flower beds when the patrol cars arrived. Beside it, a photograph someone in the crowd took that night in the community room. You can see the HOA meeting table, Karen's clipboard, her printed violation timeline, and in the center of the frame, plain as anything, sitting on top of all of it, a county sheriff's badge. Some people frame their first dollar. I framed the paper that started a war they never should have fought.